4 men entered the undercroft of the monastery of Sfântul Ilie-din-Piatră, in the Făgăraș mountains of what was then the Principality of Wallachia, on the night of the 12th of May in the year 1848. This is the record, as I have kept it, and as I intend to leave it before the lung sickness in my chest becomes the thing that leaves it for me. The names of 3 of them are known to me now, though we had never spoken before that night. Grigore Barbu, a Wallachian brigand 31 years of age, wanted in 3 principalities for the killing of a customs officer at the ford of Kaineni in the winter of 1846. Karl Steiner, an Austrian deserter of the 2nd Jager Battalion, 26 years of age, tried in absentia at Hermannstadt and sentenced to 12 years fortress labor he never served. Iancu of the Chihuahua, a Roma horse thief out of the Banat, of no age recorded in any registry, and no age I ever learned from the man himself. And the 4th, whose name I have withheld from every clerk and physician who has taken my testimony over the past 53 years, and whose name I will withhold from this account as well, because I am the 4th, and because I have not decided, even now, whether a man in my position is permitted to sign what he leaves behind. One of us climbed out of the ossuary shaft at dawn on the 13th of May. 3 of us did not. I do not intend in what follows to describe what killed them. I do not intend it because I do not have the words the killing would require, and because I do not wish to be the man who invents them, and because the killing itself is not what the record is for. The record is for the hour before the killing, and the minute after it, and the 15 years that passed before I understood what I had walked out of, and the 38 years that have passed since I walked back in. I am 79 years of age. I am dying of a lung sickness the physicians at the infirmary have not troubled to name, because there is no treatment for it, and because I have asked them, in plain words, not to name it. It is the 6th of March, in the year 1901. I have lived within the walls of this monastery, the same monastery, since the autumn of 1863, when I returned to it of my own will, on foot, from the city of Alba Iulia, and I have not passed through its outer gate in the 38 years since. I was trained in my youth as a seminarian. I read Latin at 14. I read the Vulgate at 16. I was expelled from the Greek Catholic seminary at Blaj at 19 for reasons that do not belong to this account. By the spring of 1848, I was 26 years of age, unfrocked, unwelcome in the house of my father, and available for hire by any man with a purse and a use for a reader of ecclesiastical Latin. I was hired in April of that year by a letter I received at a public house in Sibiu. The letter did not name its sender. It named a fee, a date, and a village. It did not tell me there would be 3 other men. It did not tell me what I was to read. I did not know, until the moment I read it aloud in the undercroft, that the thing I had been hired to read was the lid of a sarcophagus. I did not know, until the moment the lid moved, that the sarcophagus contained a crowned man. I did not know, until the moment the crowned man raised his skull and looked into the lantern I was not holding, because the lantern was in the hand of Iancu of the Chihuahua, who was kneeling on my left, that I had been hired, in fact, by the thing inside the lid. You will not believe me, and you should not. I would not have believed me at 26. I record it not to be believed, but to be filed, because filing is the only observance a man in my position is still capable of performing, and because I have been performing it in one form or another for 53 years, and I do not intend to stop until the lung sickness stops me. 4 entered. 1 climbed out. That is the arithmetic. The rest of this account is the explanation of the gap between the 2 numbers, and the explanation of why the gap, once opened, could never be closed. The 10th of May, at Sibiu, I was still in possession of a coat that had once belonged to a priest. I mention the coat because it is the reason the letter reached me. The public house at which I received my correspondence, the Sfântul Alb, in a lane behind the Lutheran church, kept a small wooden box behind the bar in which letters for irregular clients were left, and the barman, a man named Petru, who owed me nothing and disliked me for reasons of his own, had come to associate me with the coat. When the letter arrived, on the morning of the 10th, he handed it to me without a word and returned to wiping a glass that was already clean. The letter was sealed in red wax with no impression. It contained 3 sheets of paper. The first sheet named a fee 120 florins, half in advance, half on completion, which was more than I'd earned in the previous 9 months combined. The second sheet named a date and a place, the night of the 12th of May, at the abandoned monastery of Sfântul Ilie-din-Piatră, above the village of Piatra Alba in the upper Olt Valley. The third sheet contained a single instruction, written in a neat clerical hand that I did not recognize. You will be required to read what you find. You will not be required to understand it. The first sheet contained the fee in the form of banknotes. The banknotes were Austrian. I mention this because in the spring of 1848, in the weeks after the news from Vienna and Pest had reached the Carpathian villages, Austrian banknotes were harder to spend than they had been the previous winter, and a man paying in them was either not from the region or unaware of the region's mood. My employer, whoever he was, had not calculated for the revolutions. This was the first small evidence that the man who hired me was not, himself, of this century. I did not think of it that way at the time. I thought only that the fee was good, that the work was small, and that I had not eaten in 2 days. I left Sibiu on the morning of the 11th. I walked. I did not own a horse, and the diligence to Făgăraș had been suspended for the week on account of a rumor not confirmed that a company of sickly irregulars had been seen on the road. The rumor was correct in its existence and wrong in its particulars, as most rumors were that spring. I walked the 38 kilometers to Făgăraș in a day and a half, and arrived in the town of Piatra Alba on the evening of the 12th. I did not know when I arrived that 3 other men had walked the same road from 3 different directions over the same 48 hours. I learned this in the taproom of the village inn. The inn was called the Burul, and it had 4 rooms upstairs, and on the evening of the 12th of May, 1848, 3 of those rooms were taken. I paid for the 4th. The innkeeper, a widow named Doamna Vidrescu, whose husband had been killed by a bear 7 years earlier, and who ran the inn with a competence that I would later realize was itself a form of grief, took my coin without comment and told me that supper was already served, and that if I wanted any, I should sit down at the table where the other travelers were sitting. The other travelers were 3. They were seated at 3 separate places at the same long pine table. They were not speaking to each other. They were eating separately at the same board, in the manner of men who had noticed each other and decided, without conferring, that noticing was as far as the matter would go. I sat down at the 4th place, at the head of the table, because the head was the only place left. I looked at the 3 of them, in turn, and each of them looked back at me, in turn, and none of us said anything. And Doamna Vidrescu brought me a bowl of bean soup and a piece of black bread and set them in front of me without comment. Grigori, Barbu, was to my right. I did not know his name then. I knew only that he was a large man in a leather coat, that he had a broken nose that had been set badly and then broken again, and that he carried, propped against the leg of his chair, a wooden cudgel with a lead-weighted head. He ate with his left hand and kept his right on the table, near the cudgel. He did not look at me a second time after the first. Karl Steiner was opposite me. He was thinner than Barbu, sharper in the face, and he wore a coat that had been military once and civilian for perhaps a year. He had shaved that morning and cut himself doing it, and the small line of dried blood at his jaw was the tidiest thing about him. On the bench beside him, wrapped in a piece of gray cloth, was an object of a size and shape I could not identify at the time. I would later learn, in the crypt, that it was a handbell, of the sort a company drummer or sergeant might carry the bell of his regiment, the 2nd Jager, which he had taken with him when he deserted at Hermannstadt in the winter of 1846. He had carried it, unspent and unsold, for over a year. I never asked him why. He did not live long enough for me to ask. Iancu of the Chihuahua was to my left. He was the smallest of the four of us, and the youngest by appearance, though I never established his age. He wore a red kerchief around his neck, and a coat that had been mended at the elbows so many times that the mending was now the coat. He was the only one of the three who acknowledged me. He nodded once at the bread, and returned to his own bowl. On the table beside his hand, resting on a folded square of cloth, was a silver coin of a size and design I did not recognize. It was not currency. It was too old to be currency. He turned it over, absently, between two fingers as he ate, and put it down when he took up his spoon, and took it up again when he set his spoon down. He did this without looking at it, the way a man handles a rosary he has been carrying for so long that his hand handles it without his mind. I ate my soup. I did not speak. None of us spoke. We finished at intervals, and one by one we went up the wooden stair to our 4 rooms, and I lay down on a straw mattress in a room that smelled of cold ash, and I did not sleep, because I was thinking about the fact that 3 other men had come to this village on this evening, and that none of us had asked what the others were doing there. I was thinking also about the letter. I was thinking that if my letter had said, "You will be required to read," then perhaps the other 3 had received letters that said other things. I was thinking that if I had been hired for one small task, and Barbu for another, and Steiner for another, and Iancu for another, then it was possible that 4 men had been hired for 4 tasks that were, in some way I could not yet see, the same task. I did not think, that night, that the 4 of us were being assembled. I thought only that we were, by some coincidence of the road, adjacent. I understood the difference between adjacency and assembly 15 years later, in an archive in Alba Iulia, when a Uniate priest named Father Onisim laid a document in front of me and asked me, in a voice that was gentler than the document required, whether I had noticed, at the inn, that the 4 of us had sat down in a specific order. I had not noticed. I remembered only that I had taken the head of the table because it was the only seat left. Father Onisim asked me then in what direction the head of the table faced. The head of the table, I told him, and I remember the answer arriving in my mouth before I had time to think about it. The head of the table faced east. He nodded, and he closed the document, and he did not open it again in my presence. That was in 1863. In 1848, on the night of the 11th of May, I knew none of this. I slept, eventually, for perhaps 2 hours. I woke before dawn to the sound of the innkeeper feeding her stove in the kitchen below. I dressed. I went downstairs. I drank a cup of hot water in which a leaf of some village herb had been steeped, and I paid Doamna Vidrescu the small remaining copper I owed her. And I asked her, as casually as I could, what she knew about the monastery on the mountain above her village. She looked at me, over the rim of the pot she was scrubbing, for what I remember as a long time, and what was probably 5 seconds. Then she said, "We do not go up there, Domnul. We have not gone up there in the memory of anyone in this village, and you should not go up there either. But you will, because I have seen the other 3, and I have seen the way you sat down at my table." She said it flatly. She did not say it as a warning. She said it as a woman reporting the weather. I paid her, and I left the inn, and I began the walk up the mountain track to the monastery, and I did not see, on that walk, a single crow in the sky above the trees, though the sky above the valley behind me was full of them. That was the first thing I noticed. It is not the thing I would have chosen to notice if I'd been choosing. But the birds decide these things, and not the men who watch them. The evening of the 12th of May, at 4 in the afternoon, I was sitting on a flat stone at the edge of the monastery's outer wall, waiting for the light to fail. I had reached the ruin at midday. I had walked around it once, at a distance, without entering. I had counted the walls an outer enclosure of undressed stone, breast high in most places, and waist high where it had fallen. An inner enclosure of dressed limestone, still standing to the height of a man in 3 of its 4 sides, and the church itself, which stood at the center of the enclosure with its roof mostly gone and its western tower intact to a height of perhaps 18 meters. I had counted the windows of the church, 7 on the north side, 7 on the south, and a rose window over the western door whose tracery was still in place, though the glass was gone. I had counted also the crows. I counted them because I had noticed, on the walk up, their absence. There were no crows above the monastery. There were no crows within a radius I later paced at 300 meters. The crows of the valley, I could hear them, faintly, from where I sat, did not cross a line I could not see, but which they clearly could. Steiner arrived first at 4:30. He came up the same track I had come up, walking without hurry, the bundled bell under his arm. He nodded to me. He sat down on a fallen stone at a distance of perhaps 10 meters and took out a piece of hard bread and began to eat it. Barbu came second, at 4:45, from a different direction from the east, along the ridge, by a path I had not known existed. He was carrying his cudgel openly now. He looked at me and at Steiner, and he grunted, and he sat down on a 3rd stone at a 3rd distance and did not eat. Yanku came last, at 5:10, from the west, along a track that must have crossed the river at a ford I had not seen. He was carrying nothing visible. His hands were empty. He walked to a point equidistant from the 3 of us, and he sat down cross-legged on the ground, not on a stone, and he took the silver coin out of his pocket, and he set it on a flat piece of slate beside him, and he looked at it and did not look at us. The 4 of us sat in a rough square around the outer wall of the monastery, at 4 points of the compass, and none of us spoke, and the sun moved. I want to be precise about what happened next, because it is the moment at which I first understood that something in this arrangement was not accidental, and because the understanding, when it came, was not dramatic. It was quiet. It was the quiet of a thing, clicking into a place it had always been shaped to fit. At 6 o'clock, or as near 6 as I could estimate without a watch, a woman came up the track from the village. She was perhaps 60 years old. She wore the black of a widow and the headscarf of a married Orthodox woman, and she carried, in her right hand, a small clay bowl covered with a piece of linen. She walked past Steiner without looking at him. She walked past Barbu without looking at him. She walked past Yanku without looking at him. She walked directly to me, and she stopped at a distance of 2 paces, and she looked me in the face, and she said, "You are the reader." I did not answer. I did not know how to answer. She set the clay bowl on the stone beside me. She uncovered it. Inside was a piece of bread, a wedge of hard cheese, 3 olives, and a small folded piece of paper. She said, "I am Maria Ciobanu. My mother's mother was born in this village, and her mother before her, and her mother before her. And it is a thing that has been said in my family for as long as any of us can remember. The 4 are always 4. Do you understand me, Domnul?" I said that I did not. She said, "You are not the first 4 to come here. You will not be the last 4, but you are the 4 for this generation, and I have brought you what my grandmother told me to bring, when the 4 came in her time, which was in the year 1801. My grandmother brought bread and cheese and olives to a man at this stone, and she told him what I'm telling you, and he did not listen, and none of them came down the mountain. I do not know if my telling you will make a difference. My grandmother told me it did not, in her time. But I've brought the bowl anyway, because it is the thing my family does." She turned to go. I said, and I remember that my voice was smaller than I had intended it to be. I said, "What is in the paper?" She stopped and she looked back at me over her shoulder, and she said, "A prayer, Domnulu. A prayer to be spoken at midnight, at the sarcophagus, in place of the thing you have been hired to read. If you speak this prayer instead, the 4 may come down the mountain. If you speak what you have been hired to read, the 4 will not." She looked then past me at Barbu, who had stood up and was walking toward us with his cudgel in his hand. She said, "But you will not speak the prayer. I can see, from the way the three of them are watching you, that you will not be permitted to." And she walked back down the mountain path, and she did not look back a second time. Barbu reached the stone. He looked at the bowl. He picked up the piece of bread and he broke it in half, and he ate one half, and he threw the other half over the wall into the grass. He said, in Romanian with a heavy Oltenian accent I had not heard him use in the inn, "Peasant nonsense. Every village has an old woman who talks about the four. It is the same old woman. It is always four in these stories. 4 robbers, 4 sons, 4 riders. It means nothing, seminarian. It is a number they use because they cannot count higher." He picked up the folded paper. He did not open it. He tore it into 4 pieces, deliberately, and he let the pieces fall. He said, "We go in at dark." The one who hired me said dark. He walked back to his stone. I did not pick up the pieces of the paper. I have thought about that over the years, more often than I would like to admit. I could have picked them up. I could have reassembled them. I could have read what Maria Ciobanu's grandmother's grandmother had written down for a man who did not listen in the year 1801, and who was the great-great-grandfather, in some sense, of my own refusal. I did not pick them up. I did not want Barbu to see me pick them up. I was 26 years old, and I was afraid of a brigand with a cudgel, and I let the wind take 4 pieces of paper across the grass of a monastery courtyard, and by the time I looked for them, at 8 in the evening when the sun had gone behind the ridge, they were not where they had fallen. That is the honest record. I ate the bread and the cheese and the olives because I was hungry, and because the bowl had been given to me, and because refusing food from a woman who had walked up a mountain to give it was a thing I was not yet ruined enough to do. At 9 in the evening, Steiner walked over to my stone and sat down beside me without asking. He was the second of the 4 to speak to me directly, and the first to speak in a voice pitched only for my ear. He said in German, "You read Latin?" I said in German, "Yes." He said, "Do you know what we are here for?" I said, "I know only what my letter told me." He said, "My letter told me to bring a bell. It told me to bring a bell of the sort I would recognize. It did not tell me why. I have been carrying this bell for 14 months. I have not been able to sell it. I have not been able to leave it anywhere. Every time I have set it down, in an inn or a barn or the corner of a field, I have picked it up again within an hour, because I have found each time that I did not remember setting it down." He looked at the bundled shape in his lap. He said, "I am not a superstitious man, seminarian. I am not a man who believes in things. But I will tell you that the bell has not been mine. For some months, in a sense I would have difficulty explaining to a magistrate. I will tell you that the letter I received in Kronstadt 3 weeks ago was the first letter I have received in 14 months that gave me an instruction the bell agreed with. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I said carefully, "That I thought I did." He said, "Good. Then perhaps you will do me the favor, when the moment comes, of telling me what to do with it. Because I will tell you plainly that I do not intend to leave this mountain carrying it, and I do not intend to leave it here without instruction, and the man who hired me is not here to give the instruction, and you are the only one of us who reads." He got up, and he walked back to his stone, and he sat down, and he did not look at me again until we entered the church. I sat with the empty clay bowl beside me, and I watched the light go, and I thought about the fact that Maria Ciobanu had known I was the reader without asking, and that she had known there were 4 of us without counting, and that her grandmother had brought a bowl to a man at this stone in 1801, and that man had died on the mountain, and that his death was, in some sense, that made the hair on my forearms rise, the reason there had to be a new 4 in 1848. I did not understand then that the interval between the 4s was not accidental. I did not understand that the 4s came when they were needed, and that they were needed when the containment weakened, and that the containment weakened at intervals I would later learn to measure. I understood only that the sun had gone, and that Barbu was standing up, and that Iancu was rolling the silver coin between his fingers one final time before pocketing it, and that Steiner was unwrapping the bell. Barbu said, in a voice pitched to carry to all three of us, "We go," and we went. We walked in a rough single file, through the broken outer wall and across the courtyard, and through the collapsed narthex, and into the nave of the church of Sfântul Ilie-din-Piatră. And none of us spoke, and the only sound was the sound of our 4 sets of boots on stone that had not been walked upon, I understood later, for 47 years. The last 4 had walked here in 1801. The 4 before them had walked here in 1754. The 4 before them had walked here in 1707. The intervals, when I later plotted them, were not equal, but they were not random. They tightened over the centuries in a curve I have not been able to explain, and have stopped trying to explain, because the explanation, if there is one, is not mine to arrive at. I was 26 years old, and I was walking into a church I'd been paid to enter, and I did not yet know that I was walking into the last shift of a rotation that had been maintained, imperfectly and at lengthening intervals, since the year 1174. I know it now. I have known it, in one form or another, since 1863. I have been the rotation, in my own person, since that year, and I will be the rotation until this lung sickness finishes what it has started, and after that the rotation will be someone else's, and the arithmetic will continue, because the arithmetic is what the crowned man agreed to, and what the monks agreed to on his behalf, and what I agreed to, without knowing I was agreeing, in the undercroft on the night of the 12th of May, 1848. At the 9th hour of the night, we found the stair. Barbu found it. He was the one with the cudgel, and he was the one whose letter, I would learn later that evening, had instructed him to strike the 3rd flagstone in the eastern aisle 3 times with the head of the cudgel, and listen for the hollow. He struck. He listened. The hollow was there. He struck it again, harder, and the flagstone cracked along a seam that had been mortared and remortared many times, and beneath the flagstone was a 2nd flagstone, thinner, and beneath that was air. We lifted the 2 stones together. It took the 4 of us to do it, because the stones were larger than they had appeared, and because the mortar around them was old, and the edges of the aperture beneath them were sharp. The aperture was square, a little less than a meter on each side. Below it was a stair. The stair descended in a straight line at an angle of approximately 40 degrees. It was cut from the living rock beneath the church, not built, but hewn, in the manner of the crypts of certain very old foundations, and its steps were narrow and worn to a polish in their centers by the passage of feet that had used them over centuries in a strict single file. The wear pattern was symmetrical. Each step was worn most deeply at its center and less deeply toward its edges, which is the wear pattern of a stair used by one man at a time, always at the same pace, always in the middle of the tread. It was not the wear pattern of a stair used by a community. It was the wear pattern of a stair used by a watch. I noted this at the time. I did not say it aloud. I have thought about it many times since. Iancu lit the lantern. The lantern was his. I had not known this before, and neither, I think, had the others. He produced it from a leather satchel I had not noticed him carrying, and he lit it with a flint and a small twist of tow he had prepared in advance, and the flame took on the 2nd strike and steadied within seconds. It was a good lantern. It was better than a horse thief from the Banat should have owned. I looked at it when it was lit, and I saw that its brass housing was engraved in a pattern of interlaced vines, and that at the base of the housing was a small stamped mark I recognized, because I had seen the same mark on the reliquaries at Blaj, as the mark of an ecclesiastical silversmith in Cluj who had been dead for at least 60 years. Iancu saw me looking. He said, in a Romanian softened by the Romani vowels he used with his own people and hardened for our benefit here. It was my father's. It came to him. I did not ask how. Steiner said, "Give it to the seminarian." Iancu looked at Steiner. Iancu said, "The letter I received said I was to hold the lantern." Steiner said, "Then hold it." Barbu said, "Go down first. If the stair is bad, better you than one of us." Iancu went down first. He carried the lantern in his left hand, held low, at the level of his knees, in the manner of a man who has been taught to light the ground for his own feet and not the air above them. Steiner went down second, with the bell now unwrapped and held against his chest. Barbu went down third, with the cudgel. I went down last, with nothing in my hands, because I had brought nothing to hold. We descended, I would later count, 39 steps. The temperature dropped by what I estimated at 8 or 9 degrees over the descent. The air did not become stale, as one would expect in a sealed chamber. It became fresh in a way I did not at the time understand. There was a draft. The draft was rising, not falling, which meant that the undercroft was not sealed at its lower end, but was connected, somewhere below, to a further passage, an ossuary shaft, as I would learn, that opened at a lower altitude on the mountainside. This was the shaft through which I would leave, at dawn, without meaning to, and without knowing it existed, until Iancu, in the last minute of his life, pointed to it. At the bottom of the stair, we stood in a chamber. The chamber was rectangular. I paced it later at approximately 7 meters by 4. Its ceiling was a low barrel vault of dressed limestone, and its walls were lined, on the east and west sides, with niches cut into the rock at regular intervals. The niches were empty. They had held bones. Once you could see the discoloration of centuries of bone oil against the pale limestone, but the bones had been removed at some prior date and not returned. The niches were, in the terminology I would later learn from Father Onissim, charnel cells, and their emptying was itself a datum. At some point in the monastery's history, someone had decided that the crypt should hold only one occupant, and had removed the other dead, and had done so with sufficient care that no fragment of the removed dead remained. At the far end of the chamber, against the eastern wall, was the sarcophagus. I want to describe it precisely, because everything that followed proceeded from the fact of it. It was a single block of pale gray limestone, quarried, I believe, from the same rock in which the chamber itself had been cut. It was 2.5 meters long, 1 meter wide, and 1 meter high. Its lid was a separate block of the same stone, 4 or 5 centimeters thick, resting flush against the top of the box. There was no gap between the lid and the box. The seal was mortared in the manner of a well-set sarcophagus, and the mortar was old but intact. The lid was carved. The carving was an inscription, in Latin, running around the border of the lid in a single continuous band, with the words separated by small, incised crosses of a form I recognized as pre-Gothic. In the center of the lid, within the frame of the inscription, was a second carving, a crown, in low relief, of a shape I did not recognize. It was not a Western royal crown. It was not a Byzantine imperial crown. It was a crown of a design I have not, in the 53 years since, seen replicated anywhere, a plain circlet with 4 upright points, each point terminating in a small 4-lobed cross. Iancu set the lantern down on the floor at the foot of the sarcophagus. He set it down, I noticed, exactly in the center of the space between the sarcophagus and the base of the stair, which was the geometric center of the room. He did not adjust its position after setting it down. He set it in the correct place on the first attempt, as a man who knew where the lantern was to be placed. He said when he stood up, "That is where my father told me to set it, if I ever found the stair." He said it without looking at any of us, and without appearing to notice that he had said it. Barbu said, "Your father knew this place?" Iancu said, "My father knew a lantern. He did not know a place. He told me, if you ever find the stair, the lantern goes at the center of the floor." He said his father told him. He said it was the only thing the family kept, from the old work Barbu said. What old work? Iancu said, I do not know. He died before he told me. There was a silence in the crypt of perhaps 5 seconds. Then Steiner said, very quietly, in German, my grandfather was the sacristan at the garrison chapel in Hermannstadt. He rang the bells. He rang them, my father said, in a pattern he had learned from his own father, and which he never taught to anyone else, and which he rang on certain nights only. This bell in my hand is not his bell, but it is the same design. It is the same weight. It is the bell my grandfather rang, made again 60 years later, by the same smith's grandson. Barbu said in Romanian to no one in particular, my father was a road thief and a drunkard, and if he had a piece of any old work, he sold it before I was born. Then he looked at me. He said, and you, seminarian, what did your father give you? I said, my father gave me nothing. My father put me out of his house at 19. But my mother's uncle was a uniate priest at Blaj, and he taught me to read Latin, and I read at 14 what most seminarians do not read until 20. And the letter that brought me here was written in a Latin hand, of a kind I have seen only in one other place, which was the archive at Blaj, on a document my uncle showed me once and did not let me copy. Barbu grunted. He said, then read the lid, seminarian. That is what you were hired for. Read it, and let us see what a crown on a stone in a hole in the mountain has to say for itself. I did not, at that moment, read the lid. I did not read it because I had, in the descending of the stair, and in the placing of the lantern, and in the words of Iancu and Steiner, understood something that made me want to sit down on the bottom step and put my head in my hands. I understood that each of the 4 of us had been brought here by an inheritance. Iancu had been brought by a lantern that his father had told him where to place. Steiner had been brought by a bell whose design his grandfather had rung in a pattern taught in a single line of transmission. Barbu, I would learn within the hour, had been brought by a cudgel his own, but of a shape and weight prescribed by an instruction his uncle, a warden of a rural district, had given him for reasons his uncle had never explained. And I had been brought by a Latin literacy taught to me by a uniate priest, who had shown me, once, and only once, a document written in the same hand as the letter that had summoned me to Sibiu. We had not been hired. We had been inherited. The 4 families, the lantern family, the bell family, the cudgel family, and the reader family, had been holding, across generations, the 4 instruments of an office that none of them fully understood. And the letter that arrived in each generation was not an offer of employment. It was a summons, delivered by the office itself, to the next holders of the 4 inheritances, when the containment weakened enough that the office was needed again. I did not say this aloud in the crypt. I would not say it aloud until 1863, in the archive at Alba Iulia, when Father Onisim laid the regula custodiae coronati, the rule of the guardianship of the crowned one, in front of me, and showed me the 4 offices named in its 2nd chapter: Custos, Campanarius, Eleemosynarius, Lector, Warden, Bell-ringer, Almoner, Reader. But I understood it in the crypt. I understood it, and I looked at the lid, and I understood that whatever the lid said, I was about to read it aloud, and that reading it aloud would not be a translation, but an incantation, and that the incantation had a purpose I had not been told, and that the man who had hired me, the unnamed sender of the letter, was not, in the ordinary sense, a man at all. I said to the 3 others, I need a moment. Barbu said, you have had your walk from Sibiu, and you have had your soup at the inn, and you have had your bread from the old woman. You have had your moments. Read. I read. I did not read it immediately. I read it at what I estimate was 11:30, after we had spent perhaps 40 minutes in the chamber doing other things, and the other things must be recorded first, because the other things are the reason the reading, when it came, was already too late to matter. Barbu wanted the crown. He said so plainly as soon as he had seen the carving. He said, there will be a crown inside. The carving on the lid tells us so. The crown will be gold, or it will be silver gilt, or it will be nothing. But there will be a crown. And I did not walk from Kaineni to open a stone and leave a crown in it. Steiner said, "The letter I received said nothing about a crown." Barbu said, "The letter you received was for you. My letter was for me. My letter said the crown would be inside, and my letter said I was to bring it out." Iancu said nothing. He was kneeling by the lantern, adjusting the wick, though the wick did not need adjusting. I said, "The lid is mortared. We cannot simply lift it." Barbu said, "We can chip the mortar. We have all night." He set his cudgel on the floor and produced, from inside his coat, a small iron chisel and a wooden mallet. He had come prepared. His letter had told him what to bring, in the way my letter had told me what to be. He knelt at the head of the sarcophagus and began, methodically, to chip the mortar seal along the north edge of the lid. The mortar came away in flakes. It was old mortar, not modern lime, and it had been mixed with something that made it darker than mortar should have been. I would learn later, from a chemist at Alba Iulia, who was allowed to examine a fragment I preserved, that the darkness was from a substantial admixture of powdered bone. The mortar sealing the sarcophagus had been made, in part, from the bones removed from the empty niches. This was the second datum of the crypt's history. The monks who had emptied the charnel cells had not merely removed the other dead. They had incorporated them into the seal. Barbu worked for perhaps 20 minutes. He worked the north edge, then the east, then the south, then the west. When he had finished, the lid was still in place, but the seal was broken along its full perimeter. He stood up. He wiped his forehead. He said, "Now we lift it." He tried to lift it alone. He could not. The lid was heavier than a stone of its dimensions should have been, I estimated, in retrospect, at close to 200 kilograms, which is more than limestone of that thickness should weigh. There was, I believe, a second stone beneath the first, or a layer of lead cast into the underside. I never saw the underside intact. By the time I might have looked, I was not thinking about the underside. He tried with Steiner. The two of them together could shift it a few centimeters. They could not lift it clear. Barbu said, "All four." I said, "Wait." Barbu looked at me. I said, "If we lift the lid, we cannot put it back. The mortar is broken. The seal is finished. Whatever the lid was for, it will no longer be for it. I am asking that we consider, before we lift, what the lid was for." Barbu said, "The lid was to keep robbers out of a crown. Robbers are here. The lid has failed. This is the end of the lid story, seminarian. Move." Steiner, to my surprise, said, "He is right to ask. What is written on the lid?" Barbu said, "He will read it after. He will read it while we look at what is inside. It is the same reading." Steiner said, "And I have thought about this many times. It is not the same reading, if what is written is a warning." Barbu said, "All the more reason to read it after. If it is a warning, it does not matter. We are already here." Iancu stood up. He had not spoken during any of this. He said in a voice pitched low, "I will lift with you, but I will lift with my right hand only. My left hand stays on the lantern." Barbu said, "2 hands, gypsy. We need 2 hands from each of you." Iancu said, "My father said the lantern does not leave my hand until the reading is done. I will lift with 1 hand, or I will not lift." Barbu said something in Romanian I will not repeat, and then he said, "Fine, 1 hand. 4 of us with 7 hands is enough." We lifted. I want to record precisely what happened. The lid, when the 4 of us took hold of it, Barbu at the northwest corner with both hands, Steiner at the northeast corner with both hands, myself at the southeast corner with both hands, and Iancu at the southwest corner with his right hand only. His left still gripping the base of the lantern beside him, the lid rose. It did not rise because we lifted it. We were lifting. I felt the weight against my arms, but the weight, as we began to lift, diminished. The lid became lighter as we raised it. By the time it was clear of the box by 10 centimeters, it weighed in my hands no more than a heavy plank of pine. By the time it was clear by 30 centimeters, it weighed nothing at all. We were in the final motion of setting it aside on the floor beside the sarcophagus, not carrying it, but guiding it the way 4 men might guide a hanging beam that has been counterweighted from above. There was no counterweight. There was no rope. The lid was a stone lid on a stone box in a stone chamber, and the 4 of us moved it at the end, as though it were made of paper. I looked at Steiner. Steiner was already looking at me. Neither of us spoke. Barbu did not notice, or he noticed and refused to acknowledge. He had bent immediately over the open sarcophagus, and he was looking down into it, and his face, in the yellow light of the lantern which was still at the center of the floor, had gone the color of tallow. I looked into the sarcophagus. The sarcophagus contained a man. He was clothed. That was the first thing I noticed. He was clothed in a vestment of brocade so old that its threads had fused with the skin. No, not the skin. There was no skin with the bone beneath. The vestment was a chasuble of ecclesiastical cut, or something like a chasuble, embroidered along its edges with a pattern of interlaced vines that matched the pattern on the housing of Ayangsu's lantern. Over the vestment, at the throat, was a pectoral chain of what appeared to be gold, tarnished nearly black, from which hung an ornament I could not clearly see. Above the vestment, resting on the pillow of stone at the head of the sarcophagus, was the skull. The skull was intact. The jaw was in place. The teeth were in place. The eye sockets were empty, but they were not dark. There was, deep within each socket, a shine, not a light, not yet, but a quality of the bone at the back of the socket that reflected the lantern's flame in a way that ordinary bone does not. On the skull was the crown. The crown was as the lid had depicted it, a plain circlet with 4 upright points, each point terminating in a small, 4-lobed cross. It was gold. It was not tarnished. It sat on the skull as though it had been placed there yesterday. Its metal, in the lantern light, was the color of the flame itself. Barbu reached for the crown, I said, and I remember that I said it in Latin, because the Latin came before the Romanian, and because the letter had trained my mouth for Latin without my consent. I said, "Noli tangere," do not touch. Barbu did not understand Latin. He understood the tone. He paused. He looked at me. He said, in Romanian, "Read the lid." I said, "I will read the lid, but do not touch the crown until I have read." He said, "Read, quickly." I turned to the lid, which was now lying on the floor beside the sarcophagus, and I bent over it, and I brought the lantern nearer Iancu, without a word, lifted the lantern from the center of the room, and placed it beside me on the floor, keeping his left hand on its base, and I read the inscription. The inscription was in a Latin of the 12th century, in a hand I recognized as the hand of a monastic scribe of the first Cistercian generation in this region. The letters were incised deeply, the abbreviations were of the older style, and the language was not the language of an epitaph. It was the language of a contract. I read it silently, first to be sure of the words, and when I had read it silently, I understood what I was holding, and I understood what Maria Ciobanu's grandmother had tried to prevent, and I understood what my mother's uncle had shown me at Blage and refused to let me copy. I understood also that I was about to speak the words aloud, because Barbu was standing over me with the cudgel, and Steiner was standing over me with the bell, and Iancu was kneeling beside me with the lantern, and the 4 of us, reader, warden, bell ringer, and almoner, were arranged around a broken sarcophagus in the exact geometry the inscription required, and the reading would proceed, whether I wished it or not, because we had walked into the shape of it, and the shape did not release men who had walked into it. I read the lid aloud. I read it in the Latin it had been written in, because to translate it, I understood in that moment, would have been to break the incantation. and to break the incantation would have been to leave the crowned one unaddressed, and to leave him unaddressed, with the seal broken and the 4 offices present, would have been the one outcome worse than reading. I read, and, as I read, the lantern flame, which had been steady, bent toward the sarcophagus, not upward, not sideways, but forward, in the direction of the skull, as though pulled by a breath drawn from within the stone box. The skull, in the sarcophagus, had begun to breathe. The inscription, in the Latin it was written in, contained 187 words. I have written it down, in the years since, on 4 occasions. Once in 1863 for Father Onisim, once in 1871 for a church commission from Vienna that visited me here and asked me questions for 3 days, once in 1889 for my own record, in a notebook I keep in the drawer of the infirmary table beside me, and once in 1893 for a philologist from the University of Cluj, who asked me to recite it and did not tell me why. I do not know what he did with his transcription. I hope he burned it. I did not ask. I will not transcribe the Latin here, in this account, because I am tired and because the Latin is not the useful thing. The useful thing is what the Latin said, and what the Latin did when it was spoken. The Latin said, in translation, "Here lies, by the consent of the 4 offices and the assent of the man himself, the crowned one whose name has been withdrawn from record by his own request, that he might be released from the memory of the living, and held only by the observance of those who have agreed to hold him. The 4 offices are these: the warden, who bears the sign of authority; the bell ringer, who marks the hours of the vigil; the almoner, who carries the light and the small coin of charity; the reader, who speaks aloud the terms of the holding at each renewal. The holding shall be renewed at the interval that the crowned one requires, and the interval shall be known to him, and not to the offices. And the offices shall be summoned when the interval falls, and shall come by paths they do not choose, and shall meet at the door they do not remember, and shall descend by the stair that they have not known, and shall lift the lid by 4 hands and set it aside. And the reader shall read what is here written, and by the reading the holding shall be renewed for the term the crowned one grants. If the 4 offices are present, and the reading is made, the crowned one shall rise, and shall look upon the 4, and shall not take them, and shall return to the holding for the term granted. If the 4 offices are present, and the reading is not made, the crowned one shall rise, and shall look upon the 4, and shall take 3, and shall grant the 4th the office of reader in perpetuity. And the holding shall be renewed by the perpetual office, and the term shall be the life of the reader. If the 4 offices are not present, and the seal is broken, the crowned one shall rise, and shall go forth, and the holding shall be ended. And what follows the ending shall not be written here, because it has not been written anywhere, and cannot be. Written in the year of our Lord 1174, by the hand of Anselm, first prior of this house, with the consent of the crowned one, whose consent was given in Latin, in the presence of witnesses whose names are held in the roll of this house, and are not written here. That was the inscription. I read it aloud, in Latin, in a voice that grew steadier as I read, because Latin, when it is read from a stone that requires it, reads the reader as much as the reader reads the stone. I read the first paragraph, and Barbu shifted his weight and gripped his cudgel harder, because he did not understand the words, but he understood the tone, which was not the tone of a document a man wanted to be present for. I read the second paragraph, and Steiner, quietly, without being asked, lifted his handbell and held it ready, not rung, but ready, because his letter, I would learn later, had instructed him to hold the bell in the ready position throughout the reading, and to ring it once at the naming of the 4th office, and once at the closing of the last sentence, and never at any other time. He had brought no rope, no clapper-stopper, no shroud. He held the bell by its handle, tongue side down, and he waited. I read the third paragraph, and I came to the naming of the fourth office. Lector qui verba tenoris coram legit. And Steiner rang the bell. It rang once. It rang cleanly. The tone hung in the crypt in a way that a bell rung in a small stone chamber should not have hung, for what I counted at 14 seconds. It did not fade. It stopped. There is a difference between a fading tone and a stopped tone, and any bell ringer knows it, and I saw Steiner recognize the difference on his own face. I read the fourth paragraph, and I understood as I read it that the paragraph was describing what was happening right now, in the present tense, to the 4 men in the room, and that the sarcophagus's occupant had already begun the rising that the paragraph promised, because the lantern flame was now bent nearly horizontal toward the skull, and because a small dry sound, the sound of something old shifting inside brocade, had begun to come from within the stone box. I read the 5th paragraph, and I understood as I read it that Anselm the first prior had built into the document a branching. If the reading is made, the 4 survive. If the reading is not made, 3 are taken, and the 4th becomes the perpetual reader. And I understood in the same instant that I did not know which branch I was reading into. I did not know if the reading, once begun, counted as made only if completed, or if the reading, once begun, had already been made by its beginning. I did not know if I was saving the 4 of us or condemning 3. I did not stop reading. I did not stop, because I did not know whether stopping was the safer option, and because Barbu, on my right, was breathing in a way that suggested he would strike me with the cudgel if I stopped, and because the lantern, on my left, was doing something the lantern should not have been doing. I read the 6th paragraph, and I came to the last sentence. The last sentence was, Actum in anno domini millesimo, centesimo septuagesimo quarto, manu Anselmi, primi prioris huius domus, written in the year of our Lord 1174, by the hand of Anselm, first prior of this house. Steiner rang the bell. The bell rang cleanly the 2nd time, and the tone did not fade, but stopped again, at 14 seconds. And in the silence that followed, I could hear distinctly 4 separate sounds from within the sarcophagus. The first sound was the sound of a hand of dry bone, wrapped in dry cloth sliding along the interior of the stone toward the edge. The second sound was the sound of that hand gripping the edge and pulling. The third sound was the sound of a second hand on the other side of the box, doing the same thing. The fourth sound was the sound of a skull, on a spine that had not moved in 674 years, lifting. I closed my eyes. I want to be honest in this account about that. I closed my eyes. I did not close them in prayer, because I had not prayed in 7 years. I closed them because I was a coward, and because I was 26 years old, and because a man who has just read aloud a contract with a corpse is not the man his mother thought she was raising. And closing my eyes was the only privacy I had left. I heard Iansu, on my left, whisper not to me, not to the others, but to the lantern in his own hand, a phrase in Romani I did not understand at the time, and have not, in 53 years, ever been able to get anyone to translate for me. He said it 3 times. He said it in the voice a man uses when he is speaking to something he loves and does not expect to see again. I heard Steiner opposite me draw in a breath and hold it. I heard Barbu on my right take 1 step backward and then, to his credit, 1 step forward again. And I heard, above all of this, the small, dry, unmistakable sound of a crown of gold shifting on a skull as the skull rose from stone. I opened my eyes. The crowned one was sitting up in the sarcophagus. He was not, at that moment, looking at us. He was looking at the wall behind us, at the emptied charnel cells, I realized, at the niches where his fellows had lain until they had been ground into the mortar that had sealed him in. He looked at the empty niches for what I remember as a long time, and what was probably 12 seconds. Then he turned his head. He turned it slowly. The vertebrae of his neck made a sound like a small door closing. He looked at Barbu first. He looked at Barbu for what I counted at 4 seconds. He looked at Steiner second for 4 seconds. He looked at Jansu third for 4 seconds. He looked at me fourth for 4 seconds. Then he began to stand. He stood, and the standing took an amount of time I have never been able to measure accurately, because time in the crypt during his standing did not proceed in the way time proceeds in ordinary rooms. I estimate the standing took between 40 seconds and 2 minutes. I have no better measurement. I will describe him as I saw him, and I will describe him only from the parts I saw clearly, and I will not add particulars I did not see, because the addition of particulars is the failure the philologist from Cluj tried to lead me into in 1893, and which I refused him. What I saw, I will say. What I did not see, I will not invent. He was tall. Standing upright within the sarcophagus, his head was above ours by, I estimate, a full meter. He would have been, if he had stepped down from the stone, nearly 3 meters in height, though the proportions of his body did not otherwise depart from a man's. His shoulders were narrow. His arms were long, but not disproportionately long, long only in the way that a tall man's arms are long. He was clothed in the chasuble I had already seen, and the chasuble hung from his shoulders in the pattern it had been embroidered in, and though the fabric was old past any reasonable durability, it held. It did not tear as he moved. It moved with him, as though the fabric and the bone had come to an understanding across the centuries. His skull was intact. His jaw was in place. The crown was on his head, and it did not shift. His eyes, I use the word for the location, not the organ, were now lit. What had been a shine at the back of each socket was now a steady violet-white flame, small, contained, unmoving. The flames did not flicker. They were not fire. They were the color of the light that appears at high altitude on certain glaciers just before dawn. He looked at us. He looked at us in the order in which he had already looked at us. Barbu, Steiner, Iancu, myself, and he did nothing else, at first, but look. Barbu broke. I do not blame him for this. I think, in the 53 years since, that Barbu behaved as most men would have behaved, and that his breaking was not cowardice, but the ordinary human response of a body confronted with an image its ancestors had not evolved to receive. He broke by reaching for the crown. He stepped forward. He raised his cudgel. He said in a voice that I remember as very loud in the small chamber, "The crowned gypsy, the light, bring the light. I will have the crown." Iancu did not move the lantern. Iancu, in the last minute of his life, was doing something I did not understand at the time, and understood only in 1863, when Father Onisim explained to me the office of the almoner. Iancu was, with his left hand, drawing the silver coin out of his pocket. He was placing it in a single smooth motion on the rim of the sarcophagus at the point nearest his own knee. He was, without being told, and without knowing why, performing the almoner's small final rite, the placing of a coin of charity at the threshold, as an offering of continuance, so that the crowned one might know that the office of the almoner was still, in this generation, staffed. He placed the coin. Then he looked at Barbu, who was already moving past him with the cudgel raised, and Iancu said it in Romanian, clearly, so that all of us heard it. He does not take from a house where the coin has been set. Barbu did not hear him, or heard him, and did not care. Barbu reached the sarcophagus. He raised the cudgel. He struck at the crowned one's shoulder. The cudgel connected. I saw it connect. I heard the sound. It made a sound like a wooden mallet striking a stone wrapped in cloth, dry and hollow and final. The crowned one did not move under the blow. The cudgel bounced. Barbu staggered back from the recoil, which was greater than the blow he had struck, and I could see in his face the first honest fear he had shown all night. The crowned one, in response to being struck, did not look at Barbu. He looked at the cudgel. He looked at the cudgel for what I counted at 3 seconds. His skull inclined slightly, as though reading the wood. And then he raised his right hand, the first movement of that hand, since he had gripped the edge of the sarcophagus to rise, and he reached, not for Barbu, but for the cudgel itself. He took the cudgel from Barbu's hand. He did not wrestle it. He did not tug it. He lifted it, and Barbu's hand came open around it, in the way a sleeping man's hand opens around an object he is no longer aware of holding. Barbu did not resist. He could not. His hand simply released. The crowned one held the cudgel for a moment. Then he broke it. He broke it across his own knee, in a motion so ordinary, so mundanely human, that the horror of it was not in the violence, but in the familiarity. It was the motion of a father breaking a stick of firewood over his knee at a hearth. It was the motion of a man ending a small annoyance. The cudgel snapped in two, and the crowned one dropped the two halves at his feet. And he looked, then, at Barbu. Barbu was already dying. I say this without exaggeration. Barbu was dying in the moment the cudgel was broken, though he did not fall for another 3 or 4 seconds. What killed him, I have thought about often, and I have concluded, and Father Onisim confirmed in 1863, that what killed him was the withdrawal of the warden's office from him. The cudgel, which his family had held for some number of generations as the sign of the office, had been repossessed by the crowned one. Barbu, in the moment of that repossession, ceased to be the warden, and he could not survive the ceasing, because the office had been the thing holding him upright. In some sense he had not understood he depended upon. He fell to his knees. He fell to his hands. He fell forward onto the floor, and he did not move again. The crowned one turned to Steiner. Steiner was still holding the bell. He was holding it in the ready position, tongue side down, as his letter had instructed. His face was white. His breathing was fast. But he had not moved from his place at the northeast corner of the sarcophagus, and he had not dropped the bell. The crowned one looked at the bell for what I counted at 3 seconds. Then he raised his left hand. Again. The movement was almost gentle, and he took the bell from Steiner. Steiner, like Barbu, did not resist. His hand opened. The bell passed from Steiner's hand to the crowned one's hand, and the crowned one held it, briefly, and then he struck the bell against the rim of the sarcophagus. The bell rang. It rang a third time after the 2 rings during my reading, and the third ring was not the same tone as the first 2. The first 2 had been the tone of a bell in the ready position, rung by the bell ringer. The third was a different tone, lower and longer, and not quite a bell tone at all. It was the tone of a bell being unrung, the tone of an office being closed. Steiner fell. He did not fall the way Barbu had fallen. He fell backward, and he fell slowly, and he was, I think, dead before his shoulders reached the floor. His hand, when I later touched it, was already cool. He had not been injured. There was no mark on him. But the office had been withdrawn, and he had gone with it. The crowned one turned to Iancu. Iancu was still kneeling. His left hand was still on the base of the lantern. The silver coin was on the rim of the sarcophagus, where he had placed it. Iancu was looking up, into the violet-white flames of the crowned one's eye sockets, and he was smiling. I do not know how to describe Iancu's smile, except to say that it was the smile of a man who had understood in a moment the entire shape of his life, the reason his father had told him where to place the lantern, the reason he had carried the coin without knowing it was a coin of office, the reason he had been drawn across 300 kilometers of empty road to a village he had never heard of. He smiled, and I believe he smiled because the understanding was, at the end, a relief. The crowned one looked at the coin on the sarcophagus rim. He did not take it. He looked at Iancu, and his skull inclined slightly, in a movement I recognized only in 1863, when Father Onisim described the closing rite of the almoner's office in what was, unmistakably, a bow. He was thanking Iancu. He was thanking the almoner for the coin. Then he looked at the lantern. He did not take the lantern. He did not touch it. He looked at it, and his skull inclined a second time. And Iancu, I saw this, and I have seen it in my mind every night since Iancu let go of the lantern's base. He let go of it voluntarily. He released the office. His left hand opened, and it fell to his lap, and his eyes closed, and he lowered his head, and he was dead within perhaps 5 seconds, in the posture of a man kneeling in prayer, without pain, without a mark, without resistance. 3 of us were now dead. I was still kneeling at the foot of the sarcophagus in the southeast corner, and I was still holding in my hands nothing at all. I had brought nothing. I had been the reader. My office was the words I had already spoken. The crowned one turned to me. He turned to me, and he stepped down from the sarcophagus. He stepped down in a single movement, not a climb, not a swing of the leg, but a descent, as though the height of the sarcophagus were negotiable to him in a way it was not to us. His feet, when they touched the floor, made no sound. The floor was stone. He had bones for feet, wrapped in the tatters of a monastic sandal that had rotted almost to nothing. He should have made a sound. He did not. He walked around the sarcophagus, from its eastern side to its southeastern corner, where I was kneeling. He walked slowly. The chasuble moved with him, unraveling at the hem in small dry filaments that fell behind him as he came and settled on the flagstones in a trail I would still be able to see at dawn. When I climbed out, he stopped in front of me. His feet were at the closest point, perhaps 30 centimeters from my knees. The lantern was between us. Iancu had released it, and it had not fallen. The lantern rested on the flagstones, where Iancu had set it down in the placing right, and its flame, which had bent horizontally toward the sarcophagus during the reading, was now upright again, and steady, and very small. The crowned one lowered his skull. He lowered it, not to look at me, but to look at the lantern. His skull descended until the crown, the 4 upright points, each terminating in the small 4-lobed cross, was at a height of perhaps a meter above the floor. His face, or the front of his skull, was at the level of the lantern's flame. The violet-white flames in his eye sockets were, at that moment, the exact height of the yellow flame in the lantern's glass, and the 3 flames, his 2, and the lantern's 1, were arranged in a horizontal line at the same altitude in the same small volume of air. He looked into the lantern. He did not look at me. I want to be exact about this, because it is the thing that has kept me here, in this monastery, for 38 years. He did not look at me. He looked into the flame that Iancu had lit and placed at the center of the room, and he studied it, the way a very old scholar studies a piece of writing he's been waiting a long time to read. He looked into the lantern for what I counted at 22 seconds. In those seconds, I did not move. I could not have moved. I do not mean that I was paralyzed by fear. I was afraid. But I was not paralyzed. I mean that the room, in those seconds, had a stillness that included me, and I was part of the stillness. And moving would have been the same kind of violation as speaking during a raised host at Mass. I did not move, because moving would have been wrong. At the end of the 22 seconds, the crowned one lifted his skull. He looked at me. The violet-white flames in his sockets rose to a level above the lantern, and they steadied at a point roughly level with my own eyes. And he held them there, and I looked into them, and I did not look away. I want to record precisely what I saw in his sockets when I looked. I saw 2 small, steady flames. I did not see a face inside the flames. I did not see intelligence in the ordinary sense. I saw, and I have thought about this for 53 years, and I have not found a better word. I saw attention. He was attending to me. He was attending to the fact of me, in the same way a scribe attends to a page he is about to write on. He was reading me, in the way I had just read the lid. He held his attention on me for what I counted at 11 seconds. Then he spoke. I want to be careful here, because the philologist from Cluj asked me, in 1893, whether the crowned one had spoken. And I told him yes. And I told him what the crowned one said, and the philologist wrote it down. I did not learn, until later, that the philologist had come to me because he had found the same phrase in a fragment of a 12th century manuscript at the university library, and he had wanted to confirm, from a living witness, that the phrase was the closing phrase of the Regula Custodiae Coronati, spoken by the crowned one at each renewal of the holding. He had confirmed it from my testimony. He had then, I believe, filed his confirmation in a drawer, because the confirmation was not useful to any living discipline. The crowned one said, in Latin, in a voice that was not a human voice, but was clearly shaped for Latin. As a violin is shaped for a bow, he said, Lector, tenor renovatus est, vitae tuae terminus est terminus tenoris. Vade. Reader, the holding is renewed. The term of your life is the term of the holding. Go. I heard him. I understood him. I did not answer. He waited for perhaps 3 seconds to see whether I would answer. When I did not, he inclined his skull a small movement. The same small bow he had given to Iancu, given now to me, and he turned. And he walked back to the sarcophagus, and he lifted himself into it in the same negotiable descent in reverse by which he had stepped down, and he lay down within it, and the crown settled on his skull at the angle it had settled at in the year 1174, and he was still. The lid on the floor beside the sarcophagus did not move. I understood as I looked at the lid that the lid would not move again on its own. The lid was finished with lids. The lid had been the seal of the first arrangement, and the first arrangement had ended, and the second arrangement the perpetual arrangement. The arrangement whose term was my life did not require a stone lid, because I was the lid now, and I would be until I was not, and after I was not, someone else would be. And the arrangement would continue in the form Anselm the first prior had provided for in the 5th paragraph of the inscription. If the 4 offices are present, and the reading is not made, the crowned one shall rise, and shall look upon the 4, and shall take 3, and shall grant the 4th the office of reader in perpetuity. I had made the reading. I had read the Latin aloud. But the reading had not been complete in the sense the first arrangement required, because I had read it in fear, in ignorance of what I was reading, and without the full consent that the first reader, some monk of 1174, whose name I have never learned, had given when the arrangement was first made. My reading had been enough to prevent the crowned one from going forth. It had not been enough to renew the first arrangement. It had been enough only to trigger the 5th paragraph, which was the arrangement's fallback provision. I was the fallback. I understood this in the crypt, and I understood it more clearly at dawn on the mountainside, and I understood it fully in 1863 in the archive at Alba Iulia, when Father Onisim explained it to me in the terms I have used here. I stood up. My legs did not want to hold me. They held me anyway. I stood, and I looked at the 3 men on the floor around me, and I did not close their eyes, because I did not know at that moment whether closing the eyes of men who had died in the room of the crowned one was permitted or forbidden, and I did not want to make a second mistake in a night in which I had already made every mistake available to me. I picked up the lantern. The lantern was warm. Its handle fitted my hand as though it had been made for my hand. It had been made, of course, for Iancu's hand, for the almoner's hand, of which mine was now, in some sense, the first arrangement had not anticipated. Also a version, and I lifted it, and I turned toward the stair. I did not, at that moment, know about the ossuary shaft. I would have gone up the stair, and I would have walked out through the church, and I would have taken the mountain track back down to the village, and I would have arrived at Doamna Vidrescu's inn at dawn, and I would have paid her the small copper I still owed her, and my life would have continued in a shape not wholly unrelated to the shape it had held before I read the letter in the Serbalab. But Iancu, in the last minute of his life, before he had released the lantern, had lifted his right hand, I had not noticed it at the time, because I had been reading the lid, and he had pointed. He had pointed at the northwest corner of the crypt. At the northwest corner of the crypt was a low arch I had taken, on entering, for a niche. It was not a niche. It was the mouth of a shaft. The shaft descended at a shallower angle than the stair, and it led, I would learn, at the far end of it, when the mountain wind reached my face, to an opening on the northern flank of the mountain, at an altitude perhaps 80 meters below the level of the church. Yanku had pointed at the shaft because he had known, in some inheritance he had received from his father, that the reader, on completion of the reading, was to leave by the ossuary shaft, and not by the stair. I have thought about why, many times. I believe, though I have never confirmed it, that the reason is that the reader, having entered as one of 4 thieves, must leave as one man alone, and that the stair, which had been descended by 4, could not be ascended by 1, because the ascending of the stair by 1 would have unmade the geometry of the reading. The shaft was the reader's private exit. It was the door through which he became the office. I turned from the stair. I walked to the northwest corner. I entered the shaft with the lantern in my hand. I did not look back. I want to be honest in this account about one final thing. I did not look back, not because I was afraid to look back, but because I understood, at the mouth of the shaft, that looking back was the one thing the office of the reader was, from that moment forward, permitted not to do. I have not looked back since. I mean this in the practical sense. I have not, in the 38 years I have lived here, descended into the crypt, and I mean it in the other sense. I have not, in the 53 years since the night of the 12th of May, permitted myself to imagine what the crypt looked like on the morning of the 13th, after I had left. I do not know if the 3 men were removed. I do not know if the sarcophagus was closed. I do not know whether the crown remained on the skull. I have made it, over the decades, the discipline of my life not to know. The shaft was long. I walked in a stoop because the shaft was not tall enough for a man to walk upright. I walked for perhaps 20 minutes, though the lantern gave me no way to measure. The air, as I walked, grew cold and fresh, and by the end of the walk I could smell pine and mountain water, and very faintly the smoke of a fire from the village far below. I emerged, at dawn, onto the northern flank of the mountain, in a place I did not know and had never seen, and could not have found again on my own. At the mouth of a shaft that was hidden behind a fall of ivy and a slab of stone that had been arranged, at some prior date, to look like a natural rock formation. I walked down the mountain. I reached the village of Piatra Alba at mid-morning. I did not go to the inn. I did not want Doamna Vidrescu to see me, though I understand now that she would not have been surprised. I walked south. I walked out of the valley by a road I did not know. I walked over the following 6 weeks to the city of Alba Iulia, which is where the archive was, and where Father Onisim was, though I did not know his name yet, and would not learn it for 15 years. I carried the lantern. I still have it. It is on the shelf above the bed in which I am dictating this account. It has not been lit since 1848. It will not be lit again until it is needed, which will be at the next renewal, which will be in the term of the reader who comes after me. I lived, from 1848 to 1863, the life of a man who does not know what he has become. I worked in those 15 years, in a series of positions no seminarian expelled from Blaj would ordinarily accept. I was a clerk in a Saxon merchant's counting house in Sibiu for 2 years. I was a tutor in Latin to the sons of a minor landowner near Deva for 4 years. I was, for the last 8 years of that period, a copyist in the diocesan archive at Alba Iulia, a position I obtained not through the church, which had not forgiven me my expulsion, but through the archive's secular director, a lawyer named Domokos, who paid me by the folio and did not ask about my history. I did not, in those 15 years, think about the night in the crypt every day. I want to be honest about this, because I think it is important to the record. There were weeks in that period when I did not think about it at all. There were months when I thought about it only in the way a man thinks about a dream, as an event that had happened to a person who was, in some functional sense, no longer me. I married, in 1855, a widow named Ekaterina, who kept a small bakery in Alba Iulia. I was widowed in 1859, when she died of the cholera that swept the city that summer. I did not remarry. I drank, in the years after her death, more than I should have. I stopped in the spring of 1862, when I noticed that the drinking had begun to interfere with the copying. I mention these things because I want the record to show that I was, in those 15 years, an ordinary man leading an ordinary and unimpressive life, and that what happened in 1863 was not the result of a 15-year obsession or a slow accumulation of madness. It was the result of a document being placed in front of me by a Uniate priest named Onisim in the reading room of the diocesan archive on the afternoon of the 17th of September, 1863. The document was the Regula Custodiae Coronati. It was in Latin. Father Onisim had, he told me, found it in the uncatalogued portion of the archive 3 months earlier, and had spent those 3 months attempting to identify anyone still living who might be able to explain to him certain features of its text. He had, he told me, made inquiries in Făgăraș. He had spoken, in the course of his inquiries, to a widow named Doamna Vidrescu, who was by then very old, and who had told him, when he described the document to her, that the only man she knew of who might understand it was a young seminarian she had fed a bowl of bean soup to on the evening of the 11th of May, 1848, and who had gone up the mountain and had not to her knowledge come down again, but who had, according to a story her cousin's daughter had heard from a shepherd on the northern flank of the mountain, been seen at dawn on the 13th of May of that year walking south, alone, carrying a lantern. She had given Father Onisim my name. She had known my name, I understood in that moment, since the evening at her inn. She had known it because Maria Ciobanu, whom I had never asked, had known it. And Maria Ciobanu had known it because the village of Piatra Alba had held, in oral form, across the generations, a small archive of its own, and the archive had included the names of the 4 thieves of each generation, and the names had been kept because the villagers had been, in a sense, none of them articulated, and all of them observed, the external holders of the office of the 4. I read the Regula that afternoon. I read it in Father Onisim's presence at the small oak table in the reading room, and I read it slowly, and I did not weep, and I did not speak until I had finished. When I finished, Father Onisim asked me in a voice, as I have said, gentler than the document required, whether I recognized the 2nd chapter. I said that I did. He asked whether I could confirm, from personal knowledge, the 5th paragraph of the 3rd chapter, which described the fallback provision. I said that I could. He asked whether I understood that I was, at that moment, the sole surviving office holder of a vigil whose first arrangement had ended in 1848, and whose second arrangement, by the terms of the 5th paragraph, was in effect and would remain in effect for the term of my life. I said that I understood. He asked whether I had any intention of returning to the monastery of Sfântul Ilie-din-Piatră and taking up the office in its residential form. I said, and I remember this clearly, because it was the first thing I had said aloud that afternoon, that felt like my own. I said, I have been waiting 15 years for someone to ask me that question. I left Alba Iulia the next morning. I walked. I walked because I had not, in 15 years, been able to bring myself to walk that road, and because walking it was the closing of a small thing I had left open. I reached Piatra Alba on the 3rd day. I did not stop at the inn. Doamna Vidrescu was dead by then. She had died the previous winter, and the inn was being run by her daughter, who did not know me, and I did not want to be known. I walked up the mountain track. I entered the monastery through the same gap in the outer wall by which I had entered 15 years before. I did not enter the church. I walked around it. I climbed to the small stone cell, the prior's cell, I would learn that stood at the eastern end of the enclosure, and I let myself in with a key that had been provided to me by Father Onisim, who had provided it, in turn, from a small locked box in the archive that had contained, along with the regula, 4 brass keys of identical make. There was a bed in the cell. There was a table. There was a chair. There was a small hearth, cold. There was a window that faced east. I sat down on the bed. I set the lantern, which I had brought with me from Alba Iulia, wrapped in a clean linen cloth, on the table. I did not light it. I have been in this monastery since that afternoon, which was the 20th of September, 1863. I have not gone down the mountain in the 38 years since. Others have come up. Father Onisim came twice a year for the 11 years he lived after 1863. He brought me books and paper and news of the world I had stopped participating in. He heard my account in installments over those 11 years, and he wrote down what I permitted him to write down, and he filed the writings in the archive at Alba Iulia, in a box that I am told is now catalogued under a reference number I have not been given. After Father Onisim's death in 1874, a younger priest came, whose name was Emile, and who was less patient with me than Father Onisim had been, and whom I did not care for, but who came faithfully for 6 years until his own reassignment. After him came Father Anton, who is still living and who visits me now once a month, and who is the man who will, when I am dead, oversee what happens to this account and to the lantern on the shelf. I have not, in these 38 years, been alone. 3 men, at various times, have come to live with me in the monastery, not many, and not for as long as I hoped, but 3. One was a widower from the village who wished to end his life in something like a religious observance, and who lived here from 1871 until his death in 1889. One was a young man from Făgăraș who had, he told me, dreamed of the mountain for 3 years and could not sleep in his own village any longer. He lived here from 1883 until 1895, when he left, and I do not know where he went. One is here now, a boy of 19 from Piatra Alba, whose grandmother, the granddaughter, I believe, of Maria Ciobanu, sent him up to me last spring with a letter I did not open, because the letter was for him and not for me. He is called Mihai. He has been learning Latin. He will, when I am dead, be the reader. I have not made him the reader by any act of mine. I have only taught him Latin, and I have only told him this account, in the same installments in which I told it to Father Onisim, and I have only shown him the lantern on the shelf. Whether he will accept the office is, and must remain, his own decision. The regula is clear on this point in the 7th chapter. The office descends only by the free consent of the successor, and the successor's consent must be given in the presence of the crown, at the sarcophagus, at the interval the crowned one requires. Mihai will descend the stair at the next interval, and he will read the lid, and he will speak the consent, or he will not. I do not know which. I have not asked, and I will not ask, because the office is not mine to pass, only mine to offer. It is late in the afternoon now. The physician has come and gone. The lung sickness in my chest is, he told Father Anton at the door of the infirmary, not likely to permit me another night. And Father Anton has come in and sat on the chair beside the bed, and he has read this account back to me, in the sections I dictated to him over the past 4 days, and he has asked me whether I wish to add anything, and I have said that I wish to add only the closing arithmetic, because the arithmetic is what the account was for. 4 men entered the undercroft of the monastery of Sfântul Ilie-din-Piatră on the night of the 12th of May in the year 1848. One climbed out of the ossuary shaft at dawn on the 13th of May. 3 did not. The one who climbed out returned 15 years later, of his own will on foot, from the city of Alba Iulia, and he lived within the walls of the monastery for the 38 years that followed, and he did not pass through its outer gate in that time. He's dying now. He was the reader. He is the reader. In an hour, or in 3 hours, or tomorrow morning, he will not be, and the office will be vacant, and the boy Mihai will be given the choice the regula provides for, and the arithmetic will continue, or it will not. I have not asked for the arithmetic to continue. It is not my place to ask. I have asked only that this account be filed in the archive at Alba Iulia, with the other papers concerning the monastery of Sfântul Ilie-din-Piatră, and that it be catalogued under my name, which I have given to Father Anton on a separate sheet of paper that he will place in the box after my death, and that the lantern on the shelf be given to Mihai on the morning after I die, without ceremony. I have not asked for prayer. I do not believe prayer in my case would find its way to a recipient. I believe the crowned one has held me and released me, and holds me now only in the sense that a man is held by the last term of a contract he has almost finished performing. And I do not believe there is anything beyond the contract to hold me further. I believe this without bitterness. I believe it with, I would say, if the word were still available to me, a kind of gratitude. The lantern is on the shelf. The window faces east. The light is going. I was hired to read. I read.